Hello and welcome to another session of Hermeneutics 101. We've been doing this every month for the past, I guess it's the fifth month. So since the beginning of the year. And today we're going to be looking at prose, not the opposite of cons, but prose as in like prose narrative and how to discern it and where it shows up in the Bible, how frequent it is, and how to interpret it. Basically, what you need to know is that the Bible really has, you know, two different types of literature. The Bible is going to have, it's going to have prose, and it's also going to have poetry. And so next month we will look at the chapter on poetry. So if you're going to be reading along with us, you will look at chapter 8 for next month. So this month we did chapter 7. Next month is chapter 8. And then after we do that, we will spend all of our time looking at the specific genres that are in the Bible. So we will look at each of those in a lot of detail, and we'll spend a session on each of those, and we will go into more detail on those than I think I probably have ever done in any sort of my teaching. So that'll be exciting for all of us. I think that'll really, really help us because we've done all the introductory work on the care that's needed for interpreting the Bible and understanding the languages and putting it into history and setting it in its context. And so now we're going to start to move into some of the more specific things. So I will share my screen and we're going to get started. Make sure that is like that. Okay. Um, Actually, let me do this. All right. Okay. So, as I mentioned, we are looking at prose narrative. Even though this is session number 5, if you're following along in the textbook, this is actually chapter number 7. And this is a long chapter. There's a lot of interesting things in here. And I'm even supplementing the chapter with some more stuff because I actually think the chapter would have been better if they would have told you where prose shows up in the Bible. So maybe you're someone that is asking the question, well, what is prose? What actually is that? So biblical prose refers to the sections of the Bible that are written in ordinary, non-poetic language. That's basically what prose is. Prose is just kind of ordinary, basic language that's not poetry. Unlike poetry, which uses structured forms and rhythm, prose is more straightforward and it resembles everyday speech. I'm talking to you right now in prose. Okay? This is the normal way that we talk and communicate. Now, the Bible contains a mix of prose and poetry, with prose being predominant in many of its narrative, legal, and historical text. And so I thought actually it would be good to kind of show you which books of the Bible that it appears and at what points. So, um, starting with the historical books, we can look at Genesis, obviously the creation story, the narratives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, and the early human history are written in prose. There is some poetry that does show up in the first creation story in Genesis chapter 1, but most of the typical narratives are going to be written in prose, normal, common, everyday language. Book of Exodus, obviously the story of Moses, the exodus from Egypt, and the giving of the law. That's all written in ordinary prose. Leviticus through Deuteronomy. These books are going to contain a mix of legal codes, historical narratives, and speeches of Moses. That's all prose. And then you just take the books, really just going Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Like all of those primarily provide historical accounts of Israel's history, going from the conquest of Canaan to the post-exilic period. And these historical accounts are written primarily in prose narrative. Okay. We also have legal codes. Legal codes are just sections of the Bible that just talk about various laws. Thou shall do this, or thou shall not do that. If this happens, you shall do this. If this happens, you should not do that. That's basically what legal codes are. You're going to find those predominantly in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So, along with the basic narrative elements, these books are going to include detailed legal codes, laws, and commandments. These are written in prose. The prophetic books, whereas we're going to see they're going to have a mix. Okay, this is something that a lot of people don't know, and they really should. Is that the books of the books of prophecy? Think Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, the book of the 12. They are mostly poetry, 2/3 poetry. Okay, you might not have known that, which is going to affect the way that you interpret it. But if they're 2/3 poetry, and it's either poetry or it's prose, that means 1/3 of these are prose, particularly in the narrative portions. So when God talks to these prophets, or they get their commissioning, or they record how they go to kings and the kings listen to them, or the kings don't listen to them, that's, sections of those are prose. But primarily the prophetic books are poetry, and that's a really, really important part. And later in the course, not today, we will look primarily at the books of prophecy, and we're going to focus in on the poetry that's there. Once you know that it's primarily poetry, you'll see it all over the place, and that's going to affect how you read it. And again, we're going to spend all of next session on defining poetry. Okay, wisdom literature. Okay, so Proverbs, although it does contain poetic elements, and the wisdom literature is in the section of the Bible that we typically call biblical poetry, much of Proverbs is written in prose form. Okay, and now we're starting to see something. Now we're starting to see that you can't just take a biblical book and say, well, this book can only be prose or it can only be poetry. A lot of them have a mix, and so we should look for it. Okay, Ecclesiastes, again, a book that you primarily would think is in the section of poetry in your Bible. This actually is primarily prose because it reflects on the meaning of life and human experience. Okay, it's going to have some poetry in it, but this is actually primarily a prose book. The Gospels, which are biographies, they're ancient biographies. Technically, they're called Greco-Roman biographies. So you could think to yourself, okay, well, if they're biographies, probably going to be written in prose. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written in prose, and they recount the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We all know that. Okay. Same thing with the book of Acts. I'm pretty sure you can guess. The book of Acts, historical account of the early church, mostly written in prose. Okay. No surprise there. The epistles, when you're writing letters to people, Romans all the way through Jude, guess what? Written in prose. Okay. Book of Revelation. Okay. You might think, okay, Revelation, it's got these signs and symbols and these visions that must be poetry. I can't read it literally. Right? Right? Is that true? But although it does contain symbolic and apocalyptic imagery, much of it is written in prose. Okay, so there's going to be a mix that's actually there in Revelation. So you can have prose symbolism that is not meant to be read literally. So even though it's symbolic prose, don't confuse that with poetry. Okay, so I thought that was just kind of good to start off with. Let's define what prose is. And we're showing, you know what? It's all over the Bible. And many of the biblical books are going to contain both prose and poetry. Okay, so now I'm just kind of going through the chapter that we looked at for this month, and I'm kind of drawing out what I think are the most important things that you need to know. Okay, so if I'm talking about it here today, these aren't what I would say basic things. I would say these are the most important things that I think if you've never taken a formal course in hermeneutics, these are things that are just absolutely must-haves. And a lot of the quotes from this chapter, I'm just going to give to you word for word. I'm just going to quote them and leave those quotes unaltered because I think that the chapter has a lot of really, really good things to say. So the basic principle of hermeneutics is the intended meaning of any passage is that which is consistent with the sense of the literary context in which it occurs. Okay, that's just a fancy way of saying that the meaning that the biblical authors intended for any verse, passage, chapter needs to be consistent with its context in which you find that particular passage. Okay, and so a question that you might want to ask yourself is my interpretation consistent with the context? And that's a question that you might have to ask multiple times. Okay. Am I reading this in a way? Am I coming away with a conclusion that makes sense with what has come before it and what has come after it? Okay. And it might be difficult for us to see this. Now it's easy to see when other people don't do this very well because you see other people teaching and you see them talking, you think, okay, something's not making sense there. There's a hole in your argument. Something doesn't really work. And so these are questions that we need to be able to ask ourselves. Another question you might ask is, does it flow consistently with what has gone before and what is said afterward? Okay. Especially if you're coming to a passage that is a little bit difficult to understand. If what comes before seems fairly straightforward and simple and clear, and what comes after seems fairly straightforward and clear, then make sure that those clear things kind of connect what is seeming to be difficult in the middle and try to interpret it in a way that flows smoothly. Okay, that's just a general rule that I think we should have. Does it fit with the context of the surrounding chapters? Okay, so not just the immediate context, but also kind of the wider context. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, just to kind of make the point, I'm going to pull some verses out of their context in order to make a particular point. So I was reading through the Gospel of John because I've been working through the Gospel of John in some of my own scholarly work as of late. And I came across this interesting verse, and I'm like, I'm just going to pull like a little section here. So this is what Jesus says in John 10:37. Jesus says, "Do not believe me." That's what Jesus says. Okay. You want to talk about a verse out of context? That's a verse that could be very damaging out of context. Jesus says in the Bible, don't believe him. Okay. But what is he really saying when you read it in context? He says, if I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. That's interesting because you can see, the obvious problem by taking something out of its context. You take something out of the context, obviously you're going to change the meaning of what's being said there. So Jesus is saying, look, if I'm not functioning as this authorized agent of the Father, if I'm not performing his works and doing his will, then don't believe what I'm saying. Okay. He's not saying don't believe him. He's saying if this, then that. But obviously, we know from the Gospel of John, Jesus did do the works of his Father. And so we should believe that he is the one that the Father has sent. Here's another one. This one is overly famous for all the wrong reasons. Okay. And maybe you're someone that has used this passage. So this passage from Jeremiah 29:11, where God says to Jeremiah, "For I know the plans that I have for you." And this is encouraging for a lot of people because they think, oh, God has plans for me. God has a purpose, an individual purpose just for me. That's really meaningful. Okay. But in the context, there's a lot more that's going on here. So what does he say before this? In the verse before, when 70 years have been completed for Babylon, I will visit you and fulfill my good word to you to bring you back to this place, bring you back to the promised land. Why? He gives an answer. For the sort of connecting word, which we'll talk about a little bit later. For I know the plans that I have for you. So the plans that God has for Jeremiah involve the fact that he has a hope for him beyond this punishment of the exile. Okay. So to take that passage and to apply it today is ridiculously pulling it out of context because those are not the plans that God has for you. None of us are promised to go into exile into the nation of Babylon. Okay. It just doesn't work that way. Okay. I'm not saying that God doesn't have plans for individual people. I believe that he does. Okay. But you don't get that by pulling this particular passage. This is something very specific for Jeremiah. And even though it might be something that's comforting for you, that doesn't mean that that's the correct way to interpret the Bible. Okay. So we have to account for the literary context, what comes before, what comes afterwards, and the application of it comes afterwards, comes after you do the important work of interpreting the text. So those are some examples, and I'm sure we can multiply those if we wanted to. We'll actually look at some more a little bit later. So let's talk about a particular book's literary context. And so by book, I mean not the book of the Bible, but like the individual books that are in the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, so we could talk about the book's purpose, or maybe the book actually has multiple purposes or controlling themes. Okay. So if a book is going to tell us its purpose or tell us its themes, then we need to interpret the rest of that particular book in continuity with those themes. That makes sense. Okay. So if a book says, I'm writing this for this particular purpose, then you wouldn't want to interpret the book in a way that contradicts that purpose. Assume that the biblical author is not going to blatantly contradict himself. Okay. I think that's a reasonable assumption that you can have. Okay. Now, there's also a basic outline or a structure of a particular book, and sometimes knowing that structure will help you to interpret something within it. Okay. So that takes a little bit more work. And oftentimes, other people are able to supply that structure or an outline of a book that will help you to kind of understand, okay, I'm reading this little passage right here. How does this fit into the entirety of what I'm reading? We might also have parallel passages within the book that deal with the same subject. Okay. So if you're reading a passage and trying to interpret it, if that passage has parallel passages that you've already read earlier or that come later, you want to take those into account. That's important. Okay. Discerning why the author composed the book sets limits on the meaning of the individual parts. Okay. So, of course, why am I giving this lecture right now? Because I want to help people understand the rules that come with interpreting the Bible. I want them to understand what hermeneutics uh, are consisted of, and I want to go through a particular textbook and break it down in a way that adult readers of the Bible can make sense of and can apply to their lives, and they can find meaning and purpose in the way that they interpret the Bible. Okay, that's what I'm trying to do. That's my purpose. Okay, so any little saying that you hear from this lecture, from any of the other lectures, of course, need to be uh, interpreted in light of that overall context. So we can assume that individual statements or sections contribute in some way to the writer's goal. Again, assume as kind of like your standard that the writer is trying to be consistent in his argument. I think that's a good assumption that we should have. Okay. So it's easier to find purpose statements in the New Testament books than it is for the Old Testament books. That's just something that I've noticed. It's pretty easy to find purpose statements in the New Testament books. It's actually pretty rare to find purpose statements in the Old Testament books. It's also more difficult because Christians tend to be more familiar with the New Testament books. They're much more preached on. People tend to study them more often. The Old Testament books are less studied, and so people are less familiar with them. Okay. So one of the things that it's important to note, in particular for Paul, is that he will put his purpose statements at the beginning of his letters. So, for example, in the book of Romans, all scholars have concluded that his purpose statement in Romans is chapter 1, verses 16 through 17. He kind of sets that purpose statement there, and everything unfolds and contributes to defining that particular purpose. And it's been described that Paul gives us purpose statements like a rosebud, and it starts off kind of small. And by the end of the letter, you can see, oh, his argument has kind of allowed the rose to kind of like open up into bloom. Even though it starts off kind of small, eventually it's going to open up and you're going to see what that initial purpose statement was saying in kind of a small, abbreviated way in the beginning. Okay. So if you're reading Paul, look for what might seem to be a purpose statement at the beginning of his letters. That's just kind of a nice tip. Luke, of course, is going to begin his writings with this purpose statement. So the first 4 verses of the book of Luke will give you that purpose statement, and the first 5 chapters, of the book of Acts will give the purpose statement of that particular book. Okay, so that covers a lot of the New Testament. The Gospel of John is going to write his purpose statement at the end in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. Very, very important. So make sure that you interpret the Gospel of John in light of his own purpose statement. He does kind of echo it at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, verse 12, but it's kind of spelled out very clearly in chapter 20, verses 30 through 31. Now, if a book lacks a formal purpose statement, like the many Old Testament books, we would have to infer it from a reading of its entire contents. Okay. So, what is the purpose of a book? Well, you have to read the entirety of the book in order to figure that out if it doesn't actually give you a very specific purpose statement. Okay. So, one of the things that you're learning by going through hermeneutics is that if you want to do it well, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of reading. Okay. If you don't do your homework, then your interpretation is going to be very bad. And many of us have listened to sermons when the pastor didn't do his homework and his interpretation of the text that he's trying to preach are not in agreement with what we, using our own common sense, would find to be persuasive. So I'm sorry to kind of tell you that, hey, if you want to do this well, you got to put in a little bit of legwork. But I'm being honest with you. You got to do that. Okay. So we also can determine the beliefs of a particular author. And once we do that, we can interpret the text that the author is writing. And sometimes the author is going to write multiple books in line with those particular beliefs. That makes sense. So, whenever possible, we should attempt to take into account all that an author has said on a given topic in other books that he wrote. Okay. And again, this is easier to do in the New Testament. It's a little bit more difficult to do in the Old Testament because if you don't have access to biblical commentaries, if you can't read Hebrew and Aramaic, it's difficult to kind of know, uh, who wrote which books. A lot of the books in the Old Testament don't tell you, who they're written by. Some books actually just have like little titles, like First and Second Samuel, not written by Samuel because Samuel dies like in the middle of the story. So obviously he couldn't have written that entire book. So don't just go by the name of the title of the book. That doesn't actually tell you who wrote it. Same thing with like the book of Hebrews, not written by Hebrew people, not written to Hebrew people. Okay. So you got to be careful with this. So I'll give you an example. If we want to make sense of what Paul means by this very, very, very important phrase in Romans called the works of the law, we should consult the arguments in the earlier book that he wrote, Galatians, where Paul also talks about the works of the law. Okay, so that's important. Okay, so Paul has written something on a topic earlier, and we're reading one of his later books. Then it makes sense that, hey, let's see what he's already said a few years earlier, and then we can build on it in the passage that we're looking at right now. Of course, that involves dating the particular books, and that might be a little bit more work. But generally, good study Bibles will have proposed scholarly dates in the introductions to each of the individual biblical books. So that would help. Okay. All right. While this principle is important, the interpreter must be careful in selecting which works were actually authored by the same person, being aware that there are debates concerning the authorship of some of the biblical books. Okay. Uh, here's a popular example. It's popularly thought that the first 5 books of the Bible were all written by Moses. Okay. That's a popular belief. Okay. That's not the current scholarly consensus. So if you're thinking, okay, what did Moses believe on a particular topic? Although it might be popular to assume, oh, let's just go to, Exodus or Genesis, that sort of thing. That's not what most scholars think today. So this is why we have to have some care when it comes to this particular role. Okay. And again, very, very good study Bibles will discuss this in the introductions to each of the individual books. Here's another example. The book of Revelation is written by someone named John, but most scholars do not think that the evidence points to this being the same person responsible for the 4th gospel, the gospel according to John. Okay. They have different vocabulary that they use. They have different writing styles. They say different things. The writer of the book of Revelation will talk about the 12 apostles as a group of people other than himself. He'll talk about the 12 apostles and he thinks it's a different group. He doesn't think that, oh, I'm one of those persons. So he distinguishes himself from that. So most scholars today don't think that the John, which is a pretty common name, let's be honest, The John of Revelation is the same person who wrote the fourth gospel. So you shouldn't assume, well, if I want to understand the Gospel of John, I should read the book of Revelation and vice versa. And so be sure to consult good study Bibles or some critical commentaries on this. So you got to be careful with this particular point. Okay. It's good if we know it. Like, yeah, I know First and Second Corinthians were written by Paul. If I want to understand what's going on in Second Corinthians, I probably should read First Corinthians and see why Paul is now addressing other things in Second Corinthians that have come up in First Corinthians. Okay. When it comes to the beliefs of New Testament authors, we have to be careful in the way that they use Old Testament themes or the way they quote Old Testament verses. We have to allow the New Testament authors the freedom to reuse and maybe redefine Old Testament themes. What do I mean by this? What I mean that when a New Testament author is going to talk about something from the Old Testament, don't assume that, oh, that's what the Old Testament author was trying to say. It might be that way. It might be that the New Testament author is saying the same thing that the Old Testament author was trying to convey. But there are many times that the New Testament authors will take an Old Testament theme and they will reuse it for a new purpose in the New Testament. Okay. But the new purpose is not what the Old Testament writer was saying. Here's an interesting example. So in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, God says, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." And he is referring to Egypt in Exodus. God has called his son, namely the Son of God, which is a way of describing Israel. According to Exodus chapter 4, verses 23 through 24, God says, "Israel's my son, my firstborn." Okay. So in Hosea is saying that out of Egypt, God has called the nation of Israel, his son. Okay. Matthew is going to reuse that passage and quote it from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, and use it to baby Jesus coming out of Egypt, being guided by Mary and Joseph. And it'll say, "Out of Egypt, I have called my son." Okay. That's not the same thing. The son in Matthew is referring to the Son of God, namely Jesus, one person. When Hosea is using it, it's referring to the son as in the entire nation of Israel. So it's referring to two different times. It's referring to two different sons. But the way that Matthew is reusing it is that he sees that Jesus, the Messiah, is the royal king who represents his people. And so a reference to Son of God being the nation of Israel, being a group of people, can certainly be represented by one person, namely Israel's Messiah. So Matthew is quoting it, but he's using it for a new purpose. So that's kind of the important way of considering that. Okay. So this, I think, is a quote directly from the book. So I put it here in italics. "At the same time, interpreters must exercise extreme caution to avoid an undue Christianizing of the Old Testament. Parallel New Testament passages should not be used to make Old Testament passages teach New Testament truth." Okay, that's really, really important. So hopefully when you're reading through the chapter, you came across that sentence and you underlined it or you highlighted it. If not, it's in the section that talks about discerning an author's belief. Really, really important because the New Testament writers are going to reuse and recapitulate Old Testament themes many, many times, quite often. Okay. And just because a New Testament author is doing that doesn't mean that the New Testament author's interpretation is what the Old Testament author was trying to say. So if you're reading something from the Old Testament, in order to figure out what that means, don't go to the New Testament. Interpret it in its own context first. That's important. Okay. So quote unquote messianic predictions. Okay. We already talked about the one in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. I don't think that when Hosea was writing that, he was predicting the fact that baby Jesus is going to come out of Egypt when Herod died. I don't think that's what he was actually saying. He was talking about what had happened actually in the past. In fact, he's not doing a prediction. He's actually talking about something that had happened back in history. What Matthew's doing is that he is reinterpreting Hosea for a brand new purpose. That doesn't mean that Hosea was making a prediction of it. Okay, that's why prediction is there in quotation marks. Okay, let's talk about the historical, cultural background. Okay, so we've got history and we also have culture that takes place. Okay, So in America right now, if you are an American, you're aware that there are many different cultures. Okay. And also, you're probably realizing that the younger generation kind of has its own little culture, and that culture changes every 5 minutes. It has its own language and vocabulary and things that they do, and expectations and ideologies. And, it's difficult to kind of keep up with that. Okay. Here's another quotation directly from the textbook. The correct interpretation of a biblical passage will be consistent with the historical cultural background of the passage. Okay, so we know that we have arrived at the correct interpretation if we are taking very, very seriously the history that can be known and the cultural background of that particular passage as much as it can be known. I'm going to pause here to get a drink. Okay. Now, I know what some people are thinking. They're thinking, okay, if I have to do history, that's just too much work for me. I have to go back and figure out what is the culture of 8th century BC Judea. That's just too much work for me. And I understand that. For a lot of people, that just might be too much work for them. Okay. Good study Bibles will help you with this, but it is something that's really, really important. Okay. So we're going to talk about three aspects of historical cultural background. The first one is going to be perspective. Okay. So both the writers of the biblical books and the recipients, that is the initial readers, shared the same cultural background and information. And they lived in the same time of history. So they will never make explicit their perspective. It was already shared and taken as a given. Okay. So Mark is writing, I would say in the middle to the late first century, and he's writing to his original audience. They live in the same part of history. They share the same background. They share this information. So they're not going to tell each other that because they already agree on it. So we shouldn't expect as modern readers that the author is going to tell us that sort of stuff. He might reveal a couple of hints and clues, but he's not writing to us. He's not trying to tell us something that he understands from his time period that we need to know for our time period. They had no idea people would be reading this in 2024. They had no idea it would go that long. So they're going to share this perspective, and we shouldn't assume that it's just going to be made available to us in a really easy way. Sometimes we can get some clues, but don't expect that they're just going to come out and talk to us 21st century Westerners, or Easterners, depending on where in the world you're watching this. Books have to be situated in history, in geography, and in the context of whoever is ruling. Okay, that's part of the perspective and the background. So we've talked about how the biblical writers could be writing, during, or at least telling stories during the reign of Pharaoh, during the Babylonian period, or the Persian period, or the Greek period, or the Roman period. And each of those are going to have a variety of different kings and a variety of different rulers. So let's just take, for example, just the New Testament. Just the New Testament, okay? Jesus was born during the reign of Augustus. Okay, Augustus was the first Roman emperor. Okay, Julius Caesar wasn't the first emperor. That was still during the time of the Republic. Augustus was the first emperor, but Jesus died during the reign of the next Roman emperor, which was Tiberius. Okay, the stepson of Augustus, if I know that right. We learn from the book of Acts, but also we have Roman sources that tell us this, that the Jews were expelled from Rome during the reign of Claudius. Okay. But Paul did most of the writing of his letters during the reign of Nero. Okay. Revelation was written during the reign of Domitian, and Domitian ruled from 81 to 96 AD. Okay. So you got different rulers. And I mean, you probably know, if you're an American, you know that the culture of America depends greatly on who is in the White House. Okay. For better or for worse. Okay. So, you can't just say, what is American culture like? The question is, what is American culture like during the reign of a particular president? Okay. So we have to kind of take these things seriously. So things are going to be a little bit different depending on who's in charge. That much is true. Okay. Unless you're living under a rock. And if you're living under a rock, see what I'm telling you here. Okay. We've got to put these things in the context of history, geography, and in the understanding of who is ruling at a particular time. So that's perspective. Okay. The second part is going to be mindset. Mindset. Okay. So human language is going to be culturally conditioned. Okay. The language that I'm speaking to you right now, I'm assuming is going to be understood by you because we share the same culture. If I'm not able to communicate to you, then my assumptions on the shared culture that we have are misunderstood. That's my fault. Okay. So, of course, the biblical writers, if the writers are sharing the same culture that the recipients have, then their language is going to reflect that. And because cultures evolve, cultures change, languages change, times change, then that language is going to change as well. Okay. The meanings of words change over time. Okay. Statements mean different things to different cultures over time. We might find something offensive that ancient people didn't. And ancient people might find certain things that are offensive that we don't think are offensive. Okay. There might be things that I think are offensive that you don't think are offensive. Okay. So you can see like language is going to have different meanings to different persons. Okay. And so our job as interpreters is to try to figure out what did these ancient people mean with their language in their particular time period. We have to figure out what they were trying to say. And what we mean by that language really is kind of irrelevant, except for the application part of it, which is how do we take that ancient message from a passage and apply it to our own lives today? That's an important part if you are a believing Christian in the role of interpreting. So authors may intend purposefully to shame their original readers. Okay, a lot of the biblical prophets are writing in a way to condemn and to shame their readers. The hope, of course, is to bring them to repentance. Other times, the intent might be to comfort and encourage. And often, the same book will both rebuke and give hope. If you read the teachings of Jesus carefully, he will summon you to repentance. He will say, repent because the kingdom of God has drawn near. And he will give you hope in light of the promises of those kingdom if you do, repent and follow his teachings. Okay. If you don't do that, he also is going to talk about judgment and death. He's going to talk about weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay. But the purpose of those words of shame and judgment are to convict you so that you'll change your behavior. Okay. And obviously, if the book is trying to give hope and comfort, then that's what you as the reader should walk away with. So we have to kind of keep the mindset of what those authors are trying to do. Okay. And oftentimes I've noticed that the biblical prophets, when they are preaching judgment, they're preaching judgment to people that are far too comfortable. They're far too comfortable in their lives. They're too comfortable with their sin. They're too comfortable in having a broken relationship with God. And so the authors have to break that comfort by preaching judgment. Okay. But if people are convicted or they're suffering or they're persecuted or they're broken because of their sin, then the writers are going to write words of comfort and hope because that's what they need after that. Okay. So we've talked about perspective, we've talked about mindset, and now we're going to talk about contextualization. Okay. Basically, this means taking the context of what the original author said and bringing it into our own context whenever you're interpreting the Bible. So I'm recording this in May of 2024, and hopefully this gets a long shelf life and you'll be watching this for years to come. Okay. Once we grasp the originally intended meaning of a verse, we need to bring it into our modern context for consideration. Okay. Because just interpreting what a text meant back then is not the end of the interpreting process if you are a person of faith. Okay. If you're just interpreting the Bible because you're interested in history or you're interested in the study of religion, then that's where it's going to stop. You're not going to apply it to your life. And I get that. That's fine. But the process of taking these ancient words and applying them to our own context requires its own mode of interpretation called contextualization. Now, you should know this, and I think it's pretty obvious, but I kind of need to say it. Not all passages will find equal relevance for modern application. Okay. The census numbers of the tribe of Issachar in Numbers chapter 1 and verse 28 are probably less relevant to how you live your life than Jesus' beatitude about gentleness in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Obviously, okay? Both are inspired scripture, okay? But one of them is clearly more relevant to you than the other, okay? That much is clear, okay? So if you are a believer, then you would say that these are scriptures, and the scriptures are inspired for the purpose of finding application, but not all application is equal. Even in the New Testament, a verse that says Jesus came down from the mountain. Okay, you're probably not going to get a lot of people amening that. Okay, but what did Jesus say when he was on the mountain? That's probably more relevant to your life. Okay, so you have to kind of find what passages are going to be more relevant than others. Okay, this is why Christians tend to gravitate towards the New Testament, because it's much more relevant than the Old Testament, although the Old Testament is relevant in many ways. Okay. So nothing I've said thus far really should come as a shock to you. Everything I've said should kind of be getting some head nods from those of you that are listening. Everything that I've said thus far really is pretty standard and straightforward. Nothing's been radical. Okay, let's talk about the plain sense of a prose passage and the priority that we need to give to the plain sense of it. Okay. All right. So this is going to sound like a lot of common sense, but when people don't have common sense, you want to like take them and shake them and say, just look at the text, stop wiggling around and just see what it says right there. What is the plain meaning? Just interpret it as it says. Okay. So, with all the important background and the context work completed, the reader should not miss the plain sense of a prose passage. Remember, prose is just written in ordinary basic language. It's not written with rhythm and poetry. It's just ordinary language. Okay. So this is why it's important to discern whether you're reading prose or whether you're reading poetry. Okay. Poetry is not intended to be taken in the plain sense. And many interpreters, I try to figure out what is the nicest way I can say this. And here's the verb that I came up with. They have drifted away by confusing poetry with prose. Okay. When you take poetry and you interpret it literally, you misunderstand the intent of the poet. Okay. So that's why you got to figure out, okay, what am I reading? Am I reading prose or am I reading poetry? Usually it's pretty straightforward. Usually it's pretty easy to see. Okay. But sometimes people don't realize how often an author can just switch from prose to poetry. And he's obviously not going to tell you that he's doing that. And it's pretty common. So we have to take that shift very seriously. Okay. Now, the plain sense of a passage cannot be allowed to be obscured with an anachronistic, syncretic reading. Okay. Syncretism is kind of taking multiple things and just kind of mixing them together in a way that's unorthodox. So here's an interesting quote. I didn't put the end quotation marks. So assume there's an end quotation mark at the end of this. From the book, where it says, most Christians view syncretism negatively, for the mixing of Christian beliefs with tenets of other belief systems result in an, sorry, I don't have my glasses, amalgam, excuse me, that is non-Christian. Okay. When you take a Christian belief and you mix it with a non-Christian belief, you come up with something that is non-Christian. Okay. And anyone that understands the development of the doctrine of the Trinity knows exactly what we're talking about, which is why it was interesting that this particular book talked about this, because they know the rule, but oftentimes people don't follow it. But it's pretty clear. Okay. The plain sense of it can't be obscured with syncretism and historical anachronism. Okay, so here's a couple of examples. Okay, Platonic views of the immortal soul. The writers of the Bible were not Platonists. They probably had never read Plato. Okay, some people, I don't know why this is, but a lot of Christians, they kind of view what goes on in the world and they're like, oh, that's karma. That's what you deserve. That's not what the biblical authors believed. Okay, here's another one that hopefully it's not opening a can of worms. Modern scientific discoveries that we're learning about in the 21st century, you can't read that into the biblical books. Okay, that's not the framework, that's not the mindset, that's not the perspective that these ancient authors had. They're operating on their own worldview. Okay, conclusions reached from the fourth and fifth century church councils. Obviously, that comes with the development of the Trinity, the dual nature of Jesus, and everything that kind of goes with that. Obviously, a lot of other stuff happened in those councils, apostolic succession, praying to the saints, that sort of stuff. You can't read that back into the Bible. Okay, that's anachronistic. Can't do that. I like to use this example because it's unique, and I came with it on my own. But in Genesis chapter 12, Pharaoh gave Abraham some camels. Pharaoh gave Abraham some camels. That doesn't mean that Pharaoh gave Abraham a box of cigarettes, okay? Because camels, as a brand of cigarettes, weren't around at the writing of Genesis, okay? That would be to import anachronistically something from a much later period into the biblical text in a way that would obscure what the text is saying, okay? So Pharaoh did not give Abraham a box of smokes. He gave him camels, the actual animals. Okay, so here's one that I grew up hearing all the time. And then when I looked into it myself, I was like, okay, the way that people are reading this is anachronistic. Maybe you've heard this before. Okay. So in Matthew chapter 19, verse 24, Jesus says, again, I say to you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle. No relation to my previous camel joke. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Okay. So what is a camel and what is the eye of a needle? Okay. So we're reading this. Okay. What does Jesus mean? Okay. Now, some scholars and commentators have suggested that the eye of a needle might refer to a small gate or a door in the walls of ancient cities, which was difficult but not impossible for a camel to pass through, especially if it was unloaded and knelt down. Okay. Maybe you've heard this interpretation. Maybe you believe this interpretation. Okay. However, there is no strong historical or archaeological evidence to support the existence of such a gate in Jerusalem or in any other city in that era. No historical or archaeological evidence. Okay. So many modern scholars view this interpretation as a later attempt to soften the radical nature of Jesus' teaching. So people have said, well, Jesus, he couldn't be saying that it's practically impossible for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God by a big camel to go through the eye of a little needle. Okay. Can a camel go through the eye of a needle? No, that's impossible. Okay. So the interpreter said, well, Jesus, he couldn't mean that. So let's find this other meaning to where it's not impossible. It's just it could happen if you just kind of like kneel the camel down and you kind of push him in there. It's like, yeah, it's true, it could happen. That's not what it means. Okay. So that's like that understanding of what the eye of the needle was in the time of Jesus did not exist. Okay. They did have needles, they did have sewing. And so that's what Jesus is saying. Okay. And again, that just makes understanding his words all the more serious. Okay. So that's taking the plain sense of a passage in the way that it could have been understood in that time period. Okay. We can't take later ideas and read them back into ancient text. Okay. And we got to be careful with that because sometimes we might think that we're doing that, but it's we get our history mixed up and we might make some mistakes. Okay. The chapter spent a lot of time talking about word meanings and defining words and where you would go to define these. And I struggle sometimes because The non-specialist is going to have a little bit more difficulty doing this because the resources that are involved with doing the serious word studies are typically not accessible to people that don't have biblical languages, and they're also expensive. That's part of it. So just make sure that if you have teachers of the Bible that they know their biblical languages and they are using these resources. Otherwise, they're not taking seriously the meaning of these words. And if we can't even agree on the meaning of words, we can't have any communication at all. Like everything just breaks down. Okay. Here's another quote directly from the book. I just wrote it word for word. The correct interpretation of Scripture is the meaning required by the normal meaning of words in the context in which they occur. Okay. Any passage of Scripture, the meaning of it is required by the normal meaning of words in that particular context that you find them. Okay. Here's another quote I thought was really good. Okay. This entire section of the chapter was just full of excellent quotes. Okay. Interpreters must deliberately pursue what the original words of a passage meant at the time they're written in the context in which they occur. Okay. What did a word mean originally in that particular passage at the time it was written? Okay. Because words change meaning over time. Okay. And of course, if you're reading an English translation, you're already reading it through the filter of a particular translator. And oftentimes, words in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic don't have perfect uh, bridge words in English. Like sometimes we don't have good English words to describe the meaning of these ancient words. The common example that I use is the word for believing or having faith, the verb to believe or to have faith, but even the noun believe and faith in the New Testament. That's not a good. We don't have a good English word to translate the verb pistevo and the noun pistis, which basically mean trust, loyalty, and obedience. We don't have an English word that means trust, loyalty, and obedience. Faithfulness is the best thing I can come up with. So that's if we want to know that, we got to go back and look at the original meaning of those words. Here's another quote. I mean, we're just full of quotes here. To know the meaning intended by a speaker or writer, interpreters must discern which meanings make the best sense in its context. Okay. So a word might have several meanings. Okay. Like the word hand. Okay. If I say, hey, I've got a hand right here, but if I say, like, hey, can someone give me a hand? I'm not saying, give me your hand. I'm saying, hey, can you help me with something that I'm doing? Giving someone a hand could also involve giving applause to somebody. Okay. So same word could have different meanings in different contexts, obviously. So when we're reading something, we have to figure out, okay, if this word has a variety of meanings, and let's be honest, nearly every word has a variety of meanings. What is the most appropriate meaning that makes the best sense in its context? Okay. And this is difficult to do because oftentimes we want to interpret things in order that they make sense based on what we already believe. Okay. We kind of start with what we already believe and we interpret things in order they fit what we believe. Well, what if what we believe is wrong? If you ever believe something that you found out later wasn't true and that you were just reading passages to reinforce what you already believe, that's why we can't do that. That's why we have to, as this warning is telling us, interpreters must discern which meaning makes the best sense in its context. Okay. So we figure out what the verse means first, and then we decide what our beliefs are. You don't start with your beliefs and then you interpret it, because then you're just going to just be telling yourself that everything you believe is right, and you're just going to be living in that echo chamber. Okay. So you shouldn't be thinking, how do these words make me feel, as often is the case today? Okay. It's not about how does it make you feel. Okay. It's what would this mean most appropriately in its own context, and what interpretation would make best sense in that context. Of course, as we've talked about, words change meaning over time. A good example of this is that the noun witness, okay, at the end of Luke, you will be my witnesses beginning in Jerusalem, okay, which means you're going to be people that are going to speak about what you've seen and heard, Okay. It doesn't mean the same thing as someone who is a martyred witness in the book of Revelation. That's because the word for witness in Greek is the word martis. Okay. But the witnesses, according to Luke, are just people that are speaking about what they've seen. In the book of Revelation, the word witnesses have taken on a new meaning as people who are dying for what they're talking about. That's why it's probably best to not even translate it as witness in the book of Revelation. You should just translate it as martyr. Okay. So there we can see the word transforming its own meaning even within the New Testament, even over the course of probably, I don't know, 15 to 20 years. The Gospel of Luke might have been written somewhere around like 75, maybe 80, maybe even 85. Revelation, maybe somewhere in the 90s. Okay. So a word can change meaning just like that. And if you're familiar with our culture, you could see that words change meaning very, very quickly. Okay. Certain political parties like to change the meaning of words when they best suit them. Okay. If you know what I'm talking about, you know. Okay. So we have to avoid reading in to the text meanings of later periods after the New Testament. That's really important. Okay. So some people think that, God, the word God means the triune God. Okay. That's what they've been taught in their Sunday school class. And so they read that back into the Bible. Okay. But that's anachronistic. Okay. It's historically anachronistic. You can't read these later concepts back into the New Testament. Okay. We have to avoid that sort of understanding. We have to allow the biblical text to define their own terms. Okay. Now, in our culture today, if you want to look up the meaning of a word, you would go to something that's called a dictionary. Okay. For biblical studies, the dictionaries are typically called lexicons. Okay. And the lexicons are going to be divided. There's going to be a Greek lexicon, there'll be a Hebrew lexicon, there might be a Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon. And so they take basically every word from the Old Testament or the New Testament, and they're going to give you a definition of it. Okay. So they're called lexicons. So if you're interested in this and you're going to Amazon, you don't type in Bible dictionary. There are Bible dictionaries, but that's not the kind of thing you're looking for. Okay. A lexicon is a dictionary of biblical languages. Okay. So they're going to define the words in the original languages. Now, if you want to, as a non-specialist, really try to dig in and figure these out, what you'll want to find is a lexicon that is coded with Strong's numbers. Okay. That's the best thing you could do because you can't read the original words. Okay. And you can't tell by looking at it what sort of form it is. You can't parse the verbs. You can't decline the nouns. You're having if you don't know Hebrew, you don't understand that a word is going to begin with a prefix. It's going to end with a pronominal suffix. You can't determine what those are. You don't know what they are. You don't understand the grammar. So if you want to try to do it, there are lexicons that are coded with the Strong's numbers, and that's the best you can do. It's better than nothing. Okay. So if you really kind of want to sludge your way through it, that is an option. Okay. The better option, of course, is to, take the time to learn the biblical languages. And if you're disciplined enough, you can teach yourself those things. If you want resources on that, just let me know in the comments section below, and I can help you out with that sort of stuff. Okay, here's another excellent quotation. I think the best one when it comes to word meanings. Okay, they must exercise care to avoid simply and illegitimately imposing one of the possible senses onto a specific use. This temptation is especially great where one meaning fits the interpreter's theology or preferred position. Okay. This is saying that the temptation that we have to avoid is to just interpret the meaning of it based on whatever our theology is. Okay. Because if you do that, that fits your theology, but someone from another church does that to fit their theology, there's no way you two are going to agree on anything. Okay. Because you're just interpreting it subjectively. They're interpreting it subjectively. We can't agree on anything. Okay. So we have to interpret it based on what we had said earlier. Okay. We have to be careful to deliberately pursue the original words of a passage as they were meant in that particular time in the context in which they occur. Okay. So we have to be aware that there is this tendency It's a temptation. I've caught myself doing it a few times. Okay. So if you're going to say it means this, and oh, by the way, it conveniently fits your own theology, you need to explain why that's true. Okay. Maybe the interpretation does fit your theology. Okay. Maybe it does work that way. Okay. But you have to explain it in a way that is convincing to someone that doesn't already have your theology. You don't have to begin with a particular theology in order for a verse to make sense. Okay, we got to be able to interpret the verse and then build our theology from it. Okay, if you start with your theology and then you start interpreting passages, then you're just going to naturally read those passages in a way that reaffirms what you already think. And if your theology is wrong, like many of us have had in our lives, okay, then we're going to be interpreting things and we're just going to be, recycling this without learning anything new. Okay. So this is going to be the most difficult thing for us to do because it requires a lot of self-control, a lot of restraint, and a lot of kind of neutral thinking when it comes to things. And this is why going to the lexicons are good, because the lexicons are not written by a certain denomination or a certain person that's trying to shove his or her theology down your throat. They're written by grammarians that are well versed in these languages, and they're trying to interpret them as neutrally as possible. Okay. Now, at the very, very end of the chapter, there was this, it wasn't a chart, but I kind of wrote it down as a chart, and I wanted to reproduce it because I thought this was just really, really helpful. Now, you might read this and you might think, okay, this is really basic, and I'm not trying to, patronize you or to talk down to you in any sort of way, but these things are, they really are basic, but they're so basic that sometimes we forget them, we overlook them because we're just reading too fast. Okay. Generally, the best piece of advice that I can give people when it comes to trying to interpret the Bible is to slow down and to read much more carefully. Okay. So these are called connectives. They're little words that will kind of connect various nouns or various phrases or various themes that are going on, and they have very, very particular purposes. And these words sometimes are the most important words in a particular passage. Okay, so temporal or chronological connectives. They, of course, deal with time. Okay, temporary time, chronological time. So when you see things like after, as long as, before, now, meanwhile, since, then, until, when, whenever, while, you can see that it's talking about and modifying time of a particular passage. Okay. Again, you're probably nodding your head and you're saying, yeah, I know this. I get this. Okay. But we have to be very, very careful looking at these. We have to recognize them and realize that when the biblical authors are using them, then they are trying to specify something from the perspective of chronological time. Okay. Local or geographical. Okay. So when it comes to dealing with a place, they might say where this took place, or besides the sea, or upon this rock, or above the earth, or under the land, or, below the ground, on this, over it, at it. Okay. So those prepositions are going to be really, really important for understanding place. Sometimes direction will be there. So, he went to this person, or they went towards Jerusalem, or the words have come from the mouth of God, that sort of thing. So direction and directional words. Okay. Some logical connective words. So if we're looking at something that's going to be continuative, okay. So if I say, this happened and this happened, then that of course is continuing. Okay. If I say this, also that, then I'm trying to continue something. Besides something, not in the sense of beside, this is beside that. But besides what was originally said, let me tell you something new. Okay. Sometimes you'll have this connection in verses. You'll see it in the New Testament in particular, because it's a particular Greek construction. Both this and this. Both this and this. Maybe you'll find furthermore, moreover, or likewise. Those are continuing type words. Contrasting words. Okay. Although this happened, I'm going to tell you something new. Okay. This might have been happening in the past, but this is now happening in the present. However, yet, still, these are very, very important in the arguments that Paul gives in his letters. He's very, very precise with these. and he usually starts off sentences with them. And so whenever they happen, I'm usually, underlining them so that I can take stock of them. Purpose statements, in order that, so that. Sometimes they're just that. Very, very important because they show why the author is trying to say something that he's trying to say. The result of something, so that, as a result, then, so, hence, in older translations, consequently in older translations. That's important. Okay. So the word so in particular doesn't mean like a lot of, and sometimes like, like it is so hot in here. That's meant to kind of talk about like something really, really is something. But sometimes so is like, I just told you something, so this is now true. A really important one is in Romans 11:26. Okay, inference words, logical inference words, therefore, thus, then, wherefore. If something is saying therefore, or also even the word for, you want to kind of ask the question, okay, what was just said right before that? Okay. Logical reasons, as, because, for, inasmuch as, since, whereas, and why, especially why. Those explain a reason for us. Sometimes there are logical conditions, as if this, or as though this, if this is happening, unless this. Remember, we saw that example earlier from John's Gospel. If I don't do the works of my Father, don't believe me. Okay. But I pulled the passage out of context. I'm like, hey, Jesus says, don't believe me. But really, it's governed by a conditional statement. If I don't do the works of my Father. Okay. So the passage only makes sense if you understand that conditional phrase. Sometimes there are concessions, although this, yet this, while, or unless. Again, I understand this is going to be really, really basic for some people, but they're very, very, very important in order to follow the flow of prose sentences. Okay. Modal. Okay. Modal ways of talking about conversations. So agency or means, which is like someone did something by an agent or through an agent, by means of or with an agent. The manner. My screen went down. So the word for manner goes with the word as, like I did something as this. Comparison goes with also as, or as and so, just as, indeed, and likewise. And then an example would be like for, or for an example, indeed, or namely. So I'm sorry that my line there got cut off. So sorry about that. Oftentimes, emphatic types of connectives are important, and they're difficult to see sometimes in English. They're much more easier to discern in the original languages. But sometimes you'll see something like indeed, or only, or finally. Those are there to give emphasis to a particular passage. Okay, so I kind of felt like that's a good summary of interpreting prose. But I thought, as I typically do, I want to kind of give you some applications, and I think I have five applications, 5 things that you can take these hermeneutical rules that apply to interpreting biblical prose, and you can apply them to your life right now as soon as this session is done. Number 1. Okay, so we need to recognize the difference between prose sections and poetic sections, knowing that both are often contained in the same document and that they have different rules governing their interpretation. We spent this entire section looking at the rules governing prose. Next month, we'll look at the rules governing poetic sections. That'll be chapter 8 if you want to read along. Okay, so there's a difference between them. Don't confuse them. And know for a fact that many of the biblical books are going to have both of them in it. Okay, number 2, we need to be intentional about purposefully setting books, their passages, and their words in their original context. And we need to be intentional about being willing to listen when someone suggests that we might have forgotten to do this. Okay. There are many times that I go to somebody who's trying to give an interpretation of a passage and I say, yeah, but you've left out this particular piece of context. Okay. That's really important. If we want to interpret something, we have to take into account all of the data that we have available. If we're just looking at some of it and we're ignoring other parts of it, then we're not going to be giving the most accurate interpretation of passage that we possibly could do. Okay. So we've got to be intentional. We've got to be purposeful. We've got to take the time to do this. And we got to be willing to listen if someone comes along and says, hey, have you considered this piece of context that you might have left out? Let's be at least willing to listen to those people to see if they are, very nicely and helpfully reminding us of something that we might have overlooked. Okay. Sometimes we'll do the best we can, but sometimes we make mistakes and we overlook some stuff. Okay. All right, number 3. If we are unfamiliar with the various kingdoms, rulers, and eras of history in which the biblical authors wrote, we should make an attempt to familiarize ourselves with them in order to be better informed as readers. Okay, I talked about how the New Testament is written in at least the course of 5 known Roman emperors, and they ruled Rome in very different ways. Okay, the Old Testament covers a long range of history, with many different empires: Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, Rome. Before that, we have Egypt, Mesopotamia. So if we aren't familiar with those things, if they're kind of new to us, let's make some effort to familiarize ourselves with these things. Okay. There's a lot of information that's out there on it, but we've got to be able to put these things into their own context. Okay, especially when it comes to the individual rulers. Number 4, pay very close attention to the connective words. That was the last little chart that we looked at, as they are often the most precise tools that writers use to convey their messages. Okay, those little connecting words are often more important than the nouns and the verbs that they govern. Okay, don't overlook them. And this is why, by the way, I really like to encourage people to have good literal translations, good standard translations, the New American Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version. I really like to encourage those because they're usually very, very good at accurately translating these connective words. And they're the most important things. And often there are denominations that are split on different readings of these connective words. So don't overlook them. Don't underestimate them. They are very, very important. Little words like for, in, because of, for this reason are often the most important words in the verses. So don't sell them short. And lastly, it's usually good when you're interpreting the Bible to do it in a group, do it in a community. So get the opinion of others in order to keep your personal interpretation balanced. Okay. If you're by yourself, you can come up with a lot of weird and wacky stuff. You might not know everything. It's best to do Bible study in a community of people that are all focused on obeying these rules. And it's good sometimes to bounce ideas off of other people. I know for me, and I'm a biblical scholar by training. If I come up with an interpretation of passage that I know sounds a little out there, I'm going to run it by a bunch of other people that I trust. I'm going to say, hey, tell me the truth. What do you think? Give me, give me your honest opinion on this thing. Because I want to make sure that I'm balanced on this and I'm not going off on the deep end, going out in left field. Okay. All right. For those that are still watching, thanks so much. If you want to be a part of these teachings, we do them at the end of every month. We do them the last Friday of the month. So if I'm looking ahead to June, pull up my calendar here and making sure I'm not going to be out. That's going to be June 28th. Okay, that's when we're going to do the next one. And just let us know, and you can be a part of this. Of course, you're probably watching this on YouTube. And thanks for watching. Hopefully you've enjoyed this, and take care.